Okay, so this is a conversation between two agents talking about their favorite restaurants and their favorite meals. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to make something like this, how you can use it for various different tasks, and the process and concepts behind it. So recently, I've been doing a lot of work working with multiple agents communicating together for a variety of different tasks. And I thought one of the simplest ways to show some of this would be the paper camel and looking at a LangChain implementation of that and then showing some modifications that I've done to it and stuff. So the paper camel came out about 2 months ago, and it was one of the first papers to put this notion of autonomous GPT forward. So around the same time as Auto-GPT. This one is kind of interesting in that it really focuses on having two agents engage in a communication or a conversation together. And that's what interests me the most for this. So I'll go through the paper a little bit and explain some of the concepts in it. The thing that I find really interesting with this is that this is an unbelievably good way to, one, make synthetic data. So if you're trying to make any sort of customer service agent, any sort of chatbot agent that's going to communicate with the public and stuff like that, this allows you to make synthetic data for training and fine tuning that with some of the models that are out. The other thing that I found this to be really useful for is things like market research tasks. So surprisingly, there are a lot of people now starting to use both ChatGPT and GPT-4 for doing market research kind of tasks, where they're basically getting it to play the part of a consumer and then asking it questions, putting it through various situations to see the response that they get. And the interesting thing is that it turns out that a lot of the responses that they're getting from ChatGPT and GPT-4 fall in line with what they see from real world humans. So they're finding this to be a very useful tool for doing this kind of thing. So much so, another example that's similar to this I've heard is that people are actually starting to use it for political polling and giving it the whole sort of concept of you are a voter that lives in this region that experiences these issues. Let's have a conversation about it to see what things are persuasive, what messages they respond to, that kind of thing. So it's pretty surreal, but I've found this to be very useful as a technique. So let's look at Camel. So they basically set out in this paper to explore this sort of potential of scalable techniques to facilitate autonomous cooperation amongst communicative agents. Now, you'll see that in here, the paper's very nice in that they've basically not only released a paper, they've released a bunch of data that they've synthetically made with the paper. They've also released, code, and they've also released demos for this. So let's jump in and have a look at the paper itself. So the paper focuses a lot on the idea of these cooperative processes, and it works also a lot on the idea of role playing. So the whole idea of role playing, I think, has been done with a lot of other things before. Definitely, they've taken this to a different level with the whole use of GPT and the large language models in this way. Another technique that they really developed, which I think is pretty cool, is this idea of inception prompting. So I'm not sure whether they created this. They don't cite anyone for this. So perhaps they did create it. I've seen it mentioned a few different places. So inception prompting is basically just getting a prompt to come up with another prompt. So let's jump into GPT-4 and have a look at that. Okay, so here we're in GPT-4. Let's have a look at, just the idea of making an inception prompt. So here we're going to give it a temporary prompt, and what it's going to basically do, in this case, I've given it a temporary prompt of help me to plan a trip to Singapore. And then it's going to ask us questions about that prompt. So in this case, it asks us, what's the duration of your trip? What kind of activities do you like? What's your budget? Some key things like that. Now I go through and answer those. And then from that, the first thing that it does is it generates a prompt for itself. So this is the idea of the inception, right? Of a prompt within a prompt. Now in Camel, they are basically doing this, for a number of different ways we'll look at. But here you can see that it generates a prompt, to create a detailed 4-day trip plan. So it's much more specific than what I put in there at the start. And then from that, it's able to do a very nice itinerary for a trip to go through it. Now, then adding this with role playing, another technique that you use a lot for prompting, you can see that now I can basically say, okay, well, now in the role of a Singaporean resident that has lived here their whole life, how would you critique this agenda? And surprisingly, the critique is actually very good, right? They bring up things that I could imagine locals here in Singapore saying about these different things, and even some really nice just tips and tricks, of where to go and eat, what food to try, all those sorts of things that are definitely going to come from a local. So it is kind of amazing that all this sort of information is in the large language model and that we can use it. So this is the ideas of inception prompting and role playing going on here. If we look in the paper, they're using all of this to basically do a task like this. So what they're doing is that you start out with a simple idea, and the human basically puts that in. And then they use inception prompting to make that simple task become a much more detailed task. And then at the same time, they also use it to get it to, as you assign the roles for different things, it uses it to then basically write the prompts of how they will react. And then just fires off one agent playing one role, another agent playing another role, and then goes through it and does this. And you'll see this when we look at the code, that we actually have a class that's an agent, and then we instantiate it multiple times, one for doing the task, and then one each for the different agents that we're going to have responding to each other. And then this sets up the role-playing things. So where they're going with this is really aiming it at trying to create cooperation to get a task done. Where I've been taking it with the things that I've been doing, it's much more interesting for me is getting it just to have discussions about things, getting it to basically brainstorm ideas, which is also kind of like a task actually, but more to the ones where you're just getting it to discuss. So it's not as clear that one person is the assistant and one person is the user, where you've got two humans basically conversing about a particular topic and subject. So the paper is definitely worth reading if you're interested in doing some of this stuff. I mentioned the inception prompting already. They go through quite a bit about how they do this, how they chunk together different parts of the prompt. My guess is they've done this in a very iterative way, because they also mention some of the problems that come up with this kind of thing. I'll come back to the scenarios. Let's just look at the challenges faced. So there are four main sort of challenges that they face in here. One is role flipping. So where the agent decides that it just is going to become the other agent instead. And so you get these sort of confusion things going on there. And they basically add things in to stop this, right? So they've obviously gone through, iteratively worked out that this is happening, then fine-tune their prompts to basically stop this. Assistant repeats instructions. So this is another sort of thing that you'll see. And it's never perfect, right? The other one is just not great replies, and then infinite loop messages. So you will find these things happen for sure when you're doing it. But if you're making synthetic data, you are able to make a lot of synthetic data that would be very realistic for your particular task. So let's look at some of the scenarios that they create. One of them is this AI society. To create an AI society data set, they basically, have a list of, we can see this down here. They have a list of different assistant roles, a list of different user roles, and then they have different domains that can be applied to these things. They also do a code generation thing where they have a list of code languages, and they propose tasks that would fit into those as well. So the paper is definitely worth looking at. And you can see here that they've got a bunch of interesting information about, like, how do you terminate a conversation like this? How do you set these things up in the prompt so that it will go and flow along nicely? So if you're interested in any sort of autonomous GPT stuff, this is definitely worth reading and going through the paper carefully. Okay, so they've also put up some demos that you can play with. So here you can see, for example, the idea of you would pick the assistant role that you want. You would then pick the user role for something like this. And you would then basically have it create a universal task. So this is where the basic sort of task for this, and then it will generate the inception prompts and stuff like that itself and run through it. Here it's basically, this is the prompt generated from this. The simplest prompt was help me do my job. And this is a longer prompt based on this prompt that we've got here. They've got another one that you can look at too for doing like the AI Society or the code chat demos, where you can basically select the language that the assistant's going to be using. Let's pick Python, and we could select the user of what would they want made, and it will then basically create a different task and start generating. So some of these I think are pre-made already so that you can see the data sets, because they've released quite big data sets of this. For both the code chat, I think is 50,000 examples. The AI Society is about 25,000 examples, but you can have a play with these. Let's jump into the code and we'll look at how you could do this yourself now. Okay, so the code that I'm going to go through here is a modified version of the LangChain implementation of Camel. I've got various different versions of this, so I forget exactly how modified this one is. If people are interested in the future, I will do a version that uses a local LLM, but for sake of convenience and showing this, the code is much simpler when it's just a straight up using the OpenAI model. So here we're using the GPT 3.5 Turbo model, the ChatGPT model. And one of the key things about this model that you need to take into account when you're building something like this is the whole idea of the system prompt with a system message, a human message, and an AI message. And you also need to give some thought to that actually with the ChatGPT model, it doesn't listen to the system message as much as the GPT-4 model does in there. But anyway, we're bringing these in. We're going to use these in here. So the next thing is just the agent. So here I've left it pretty much the same as what the standard LangChain implementation is. But certainly as you get to more advanced versions of this, you'll want to play around with your own agent here. But this is the Camel agent. So you pass in basically a model. In this case, it's going to be the ChatGPT, the OpenAI model here. You're going to have system messages, and then it can basically reset its messages. It can store messages, it can update messages. And then the step function is basically where you pass in an input. It gets added to the messages here, but more importantly, it calls the model here with that input once it's formatted, and then basically gives you back your response there. So this is where the key logic happens. And if you are interested for doing your own model, you would still use this. The only challenge that you'll have for most of the local language models is that they won't use this kind of system human AI message. So you need to code that out to just be a standard sort of prompt in here. So the next thing up is to look at the setting up the actual sort of tasks that we're going to do here. So I've got a couple of ones that I've done. For me, rather than do the sort of traditional Camel way of having a task with instructions and then responses and stuff like that, I'm actually much more interested in having them discuss something, having a sort of interaction that can be used for something like market research or something that we can then filter later on to basically get information out of this. This is also a really good way for creating synthetic data to train your models for various tasks. So if you wanted to basically train up a model that's really focused on one type of conversation with people, this is where you could basically use this to create a variety of synthetic data in this case as well. All right, so once we've put in, the roles here. So in this case, I've put in the Singapore Tourism Board, person that works for them, and then a tourist that's never been to Singapore. And they're going to discuss the best tourist attractions to see in Singapore. Once we've got this sort of simple task, we use inception prompting to basically get a more advanced prompt out of this. And basically the idea with this, the inception prompting, again, is just that we're using a prompt to create another prompt or prompts. In this case, we're using it to create the task specifier prompt. So you'll see that this is basically just making up an agent, instantiating a Camel agent in this case, that's literally just going to take in this as being its core prompt. The idea is that it's going to basically take in the name of the assistant, the name of the user, and the sort of small task that we assigned it. And then it's going to come up with a longer prompt, which is going to be used for actually kickstarting everything in here. Once we've done that, we've got our specified task, and you see if the original prompt was discuss the best tourist attractions in Singapore, it's now turned that into, as a representative of the Singapore Tourism Board, engage in a conversation with a first-time tourist to Singapore and recommend top 3 must-visit tourist attractions based on their interest and preferences. We've got a much longer prompt in here now for that we can use for this thing. So that's the key part there. Next up is basically creating the inception prompts for the 2 agents that we're going to have. So in this case, they originally referred to this as the AI assistant and AI user. Really, these could become anything that you want to. And you really want to play around with these prompts in here as well. I found for other sort of tasks, just by playing around with this, you can really get the people to act as if they're just having a casual conversation, a formal debate, a whole bunch of different things that you can do with this kind of thing. But once you've got those 2 done, then you basically are going to need, so this is basically just for sorting out, this is just a helper function for sorting out the system message, human message, AI message part. But then you really want to instantiate everything and get it going. So here you can see that we're basically just taking out the roles and the specified tasks that we've already created above. We're instantiating 2 agents, one that's going to be the assistant agent, one that's going to be the user agent in here. We reset both of those. So we've basically just taken that class, instantiated them twice, and it's exactly the same class, right? Because we just need them to respond back and forth in a certain way. Once we've got that, we can basically just kick off the first agent. So get that ready to go and pass that in and pass back our first user message. And then we're going to basically run a loop. But just before that, we've got here a simple function for saving out the conversation at the end so that we can use it. This is key, obviously, if you want to pass the conversation later on, use it for something, you want to save it. And then here's where a lot of the magic happens. On the whole, this is basically just a loop, a while loop, where we define the number of turns that we want. So in here, I've put it to 15 turns. You could make it smaller or bigger for this. I've also added in a callback. So at the end, we can basically see how many tokens we used, what the cost of the whole thing was, that kind of thing, as we go through it. And then we can see that basically this loop will just go through. It will ping the user agent with the message that we started off with. That will become the user message that gets put into that gets printed out, added to our conversation here, but then it gets passed into the other agent here as well. And it will then come back and we'll get the assistant AI message. And we then basically just go on this loop of having, these things converted and passed back and forth. And so while we're printing it out each time, we're also appending it to our conversation list that we'll use to basically put it into a text file and save it. Once they come to the task being done, then we're just going to, write out the details about this and save the conversation. And sure enough, you can see it will kick off. It will start, doing the conversation. In this case, it's suggesting places that people could visit. And you'll see that as we get down to the bottom, it will come to the end of the conversation. And at the end of the conversation, it will basically tell us, okay, how many tokens were used, how many were actual prompt tokens, how many were completion tokens, and then the total cost of this. So if you're using, 5 rounds of the conversation or 10 rounds of the conversation, it'll be less than this. In this case, you can see I used the full 30 rounds because I've got full 15 rounds because we've got 30 different requests, one for each side of the conversation going on there. In the end, this conversation cost me 17 cents for doing it. So it gives you an idea of how to do it. Like I said, in future videos, if people want, we can try it with some of the open source models. You will find that it's very hard to get good results for this because a lot of the models are not trained for chat. They're actually trained for instructions rather than chat. But anyway, it gives you an idea of how you could use this for market research, how you could use it for synthetic data, how you could use it for a variety of different tasks going forward. Anyway, as always, if you've got any questions, please put them in the comments below. If you found this video useful, please click like and subscribe. I will talk to you in the next video. Bye for now.